First, we're going to go ahead and lay all the skid plates out on the floor as we've done here. This will consist of the DEF tank and muffler skid here in the back. It will consist of the fuel tank skid here on our left with the 3 brackets, the resonator skid on the right, the main belly pan system with the 2 cross members, the oil pan in the front, and the 2 brackets. We'll also locate our nuts and bolts and hardware as showing here in the bags. And now from here, we are going to go ahead and remove the factory cross members that are underneath the Jeep. We'll go ahead and show those here of what we're going to remove. Not all Jeeps have these, but on the Rubicon models, there's a factory cross member or skid plate here. It really doesn't cover much, but it's designed to give you a little bit of protection. Nothing in comparison to what we're about ready to install. So what you're going to do is you're going to remove the factory pieces that they've installed here. This includes this brace piece between the cross member and the fuel tank that goes across from each side, the piece around the muffler, resonator on the exhaust side, and the one here in the front. To do that, you're going to use a 16mm socket on the big bolts on the outer edge and a 13 here in the small ones. Let's go ahead and start removing it. Save the hardware, because in certain places we will reuse the hardware here today. Let's go ahead and remove the rest of these and we'll show you what it looks like with them removed. Go ahead and locate the cross member. This is the Rockhard 4x4 solid cross member that goes in front of the fuel tank skid. How you'll tell the difference is it has a short spacer that goes on the driver's side and a longer spacer on the passenger side. Go ahead and slip this in place on top of the fuel tank from frame rail to frame rail. Now we're going to go ahead and grab the large belly pan and we're going to go ahead and mount it with the bolts right here into the factory cross member threads. Now what we've done so far is we went ahead and installed the rear cross member above the fuel tank skid and out to the frame rail on each side. The longer of the welded on spacers goes on the passenger side. Now we went ahead and set the main belly pan skid up here and attached it to the cross member. Now some people are like, oh, it's easier on a lift. That is almost easier to do on the ground because you can actually put it on like a floor jack, roll it underneath, and move it up into a place. We went ahead and started with the 3 bolts here in the center that are 12mm by 60mm long with the tapered washers. Now these are loose at the time, allowing our skid plate to move around. Now we're going to go ahead and take 2 12mm by 90 and install them in the outer corners here in the back. Lining up the belly pan with the cross member into the frame rail. We'll do that on each side here in the back. Now we're going to go ahead and take 2 of the 12mm by 60mm and put them in the front with tapered washers. Next, we're going to go ahead and take a 19mm socket and go ahead and just bring this pan up evenly, but leaving it loose here in the back, especially as we need to slide the fuel tank skid in between the cross member and the belly pan, and also the part of the exhaust shield here. Now that we've set the belly pan in place with the rear cross member in place above the fuel tank skid, we started 3 of the 12mm by 60mm bolts with tapered washers here at the cross member. And we've started 2 of the 12mm by 90 with tapered washers here out the out of the corner. You notice how loose we are here? We want to leave it that way as we can move it around. Now we're going to go ahead and slip the front cross member in place on each side with the belly pan loose. We're going to set it here in place like this. Now we're going to take the front cross member, we're going to line it up with the bolt holes here in the bottom so we know which direction. We're going to slip it up here in place like that. Now we're going to go ahead and take 2 of the 12mm by 60 bolts with tapered washers and start at each front corner. Now that we've started all of the bolts that hold the main belly pan in place on the corners, here in the 4 and the 3 crossed here, we're going to go ahead and take a 19mm socket and just bring them up a little bit. We're going to leave some room across the back as we need to slide the other two skid plates in between the cross member and the belly pan. One thing to pay attention is when we do bring this up, we are tightening all the bolts, not all at once. A little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here. This brings this big belly pan skid up evenly on each side. Okay. Now that we've brought this pan in place, we're going to go ahead and start with installing the skid plate over the exhaust on the passenger side. Now we're going to go ahead and install the exhaust skid into between the belly pan and the cross member. In the back here, we will mount these to the outer frame rail and to the inner cross member with the factory bolts that we took out of the factory shield. Now that we've got the exhaust shield in place with the factory bolts or our bolts supplied here in the back and at the upper cross member, we're going to take the 1/2 inch by 1.5 bolts and thread them into the cross member with the tapered washers on the bottom. Being sure to leave everything finger loose at this time. Now we're going to go ahead and install the fuel tank skid next. Now to install the fuel tank skid, we're going to go ahead and use an 18mm socket and remove the 2 bolts here on the outer side of the fuel tank where it mounts to the frame. Now we're going to go ahead and take the rock hard 4x4 fuel tank cover and slide it in between the cross member and the fuel tank skid and start the 2 bolts that we just removed on the outer side. Now we're going to go ahead and take that 18mm socket and bring the outer 2 bolts that we just started back into the frame, but leaving them loose so we can move the skid plate around until we get everything lined up. Now we're going to go ahead and locate the carriage bolts that go here in the cross member. These bolts will go completely through the cross member with the nuts and washers on the top side. Now that we got the fuel tank skid held up in place here in between the cross member and the skid plate in the front with the factory bolts on the outside loose, we're going to go ahead and locate the carriage bolt, the smaller one in the package, and the 2 larger ones that are 1/2 inch. The larger one goes on the outside, the center one here is the smaller one, and the one on the far right hand side is the larger one again. You will put these up through the cross member with a washer and a nut on the top side. This one's here a little harder to reach, but it can be done. Now we're going to go ahead and locate the 3 braces that go from the skid plate up to the frame of the Jeep. Customers have asked, all of our bracketry has a number on it. This is a 90501A, which is the one that goes here. It's going to mount to the skid plate here and to the factory bolt up above on this cross member. The 90501B, it's kind of hard to see in the powder coat, is going to mount here on the factory frame rail and come down to the skid plate here. And a 90501C is going to mount here on the outside. We're going to go ahead and remove the factory bolts here at the top on each area so that we can install the bracketry. Now that I've went ahead and put the bracket in place, I went ahead and did the rear bracket closest to the rear end in the center, the pumpkin. First, I used our replacement bolt on the top, as if you use the factory bolt, the washer has a tendency to bind a little bit. Go ahead and install the top of the bracket, hold the bottom of the skid plate up, and install the bolt and washer on the bottom. Now we're going to go ahead and snug those up. That'll hold the skid plate in place while we go ahead and remove the other mounting bolts that hold the factory fuel tank in place so we can install the other 2 brackets. Now we're going to go ahead and use 2 9/16 wrenches and tighten the lower bracket. The reason I went ahead and did the rear bracket first is it holds the skid plate up in place in the back so that the side bracket and the side bracket next to the driver's side passenger wheel will be easier to install. Now on the front A bracket, you can use the factory bolt or you can use the rock hard 4x4 one supplied. Go ahead and install it on the top and put the bolt in here on the bottom with the nut. Now that we've went ahead and snugged up the rear bracket, which will hold the fuel tank in place, we're going to go ahead and grab the C bracket, which is the bracket that has the little bit of a bend on the end. That bracket goes right here in the center of the fuel tank next to the drive line. You can use the factory bolt, or it's a little bit easier to use the rock hard 4x4 bolt because it doesn't have the washer, which will get close to the bracket. Go ahead and install the bolt in the top. And go ahead and install the bolt and the nut on the bottom. Now go ahead and take a 9/16 wrench and tighten the bottom. And if you're using our bolts, you're going to use a 19mm to tighten the top. Now we're going to go ahead and install the A bracket here in the back corner. This goes from the skid plate here to this upper frame rail bolt that we just removed. Go ahead and use a 19mm and tighten the top, and 9/16 wrenches to tighten the bottom. All right, now that we've tightened the brackets around the fuel tank skid, we're going to go ahead and start tightening the brackets around the exhaust skid and then around the belly pan skid. When installing the main belly pan skid, we're going to use a 60mm bolt on the three corners and a 90mm bolt here on the passenger side rear corner. This is the one that also has the longer spacer welded to the cross member. Go ahead and snug those bolts up at this time. Now what we've done here is we've removed the factory bolt on this motor mount here. Now this is the inner bolt on the backwards bracket towards the transmission. Now what we've done is we've reached through the wheel well here on the outside to go ahead and take that bolt out. We did it with a 13mm socket to remove it and a 17mm socket to bring it back in with the new bolt. I also used a ratcheting in wrench to do it also. Now we're going to go move to the driver's side. Now on this side here, we can do it pretty much without doing through the wheel well with a 13mm in wrench here. I can tell you that doing the driver's side is much easier than doing the passenger side. I even lost my patience a couple times on the passenger side. It's kind of a pain, but with a little bit of persistence, you can go ahead and do that. It will work out. As my wife always tells my kids, you can do hard things. What we're doing here is we're replacing these bolts with longer ones to allow us to mount the bracket on the bottom side of the bolt. Now that we've installed the longer bolts on the driver and the passenger side, we're going to locate the bracket that has the part number 90561-G. This is the driver's side bracket. Now you're going to install it with the quick bend at the top. Go ahead and put it on the bolt, put the washer and the nut. Go ahead and bring that up, move it a little bit loose here so you'll be able to align it easily with the oil pan. Now we're going to go ahead and do the passenger side now. Now we're going to go ahead and do the passenger side. We'll go ahead and put the bracket up in place, install the washer and the nut. Go ahead and bring the nut up using a 17mm socket also, but do not fully tighten at this time. Next, we're going to go ahead and bring the oil pan up in place. Now I've went ahead and hung the oil pan skid in place. It's kind of hard to film and do that at the same time. I went ahead and used the 1/2-inch bolts that are 1.5 inches long with the tapered washers here that thread into the cross member that we installed. And then the 1/2-inch bolts with the nylock nuts on the inside of the plate along with the arms. Now, the plate has a little bit of give here, and we've slotted these holes for guys that have different pumpkins and such in their Jeeps that might change out their front ends. This will allow you to move it over and give clearance. Just when you tighten these bolts, make sure that you move it over to where it works best to give you adequate clearance around the front end and around the oil pan. Then at that point, go ahead and start snugging up the bolts. Now we're going to go ahead and use a 3/4 inch socket and go ahead and tighten up the bolts. Checking our clearances to make sure that we're good all the way around, and then go ahead and put them tight in place. Now we'll tighten up the arms at the oil pan skid, and then we'll take a 17mm socket and double check the tightness of our nuts on the motor mount bolts. Now we're going to go ahead and talk about the exhaust and DEF tank skid plate that comes with our full underbelly skid plate system for these diesels. In this hole right here, you'll find that there is a factory nut installed on most of the models. If your Jeep does not, you can get what we call these rib nuts from Jeep, and they just install in the frame, and then you'll take a bolt with a washer and tighten it down. That'll expand this rib nut and cause it to create pressure into the frame rail, and which will hold it in place. Therefore, you'll put nuts in there. Let's do that now. Now we're going to go ahead and install a rib nut on the driver's side here also. Now that we have the nut inserts installed in the frame on each side, we're going to go ahead and set the skid plate up, start the 2 bolts in the back, and then we're going to raise it up and we'll put the self-tappers into the cross member here. So when you put this skid plate on, you've installed the 2 nut inserts in the back of the frame on each side, if your Jeep is not equipped with them, and we'll give you the Mopar part number if you don't have them. This here skid plate, what it does is it catches on the lip of the front of this cross member. So when you put it up here, you want to bring it up and put it on the front of the cross member first, then bring it up and go ahead and put the bolts in here in the back. Now, what we do is we're going to use some self-tapping screws that go across into this cross member to hold it in place. What we're going to do is we're going to drill it first, get it a pre-drill, and go ahead and install those screws.